And so people would get up to courage and they'd say, "Are you a universalist?" And I would say, "Oh, it's much, much, much worse than that. It's much worse than that."
I'm John Stevens, and this is Pod Have Mercy. This is Pod Have Mercy.
Today we have a writer and an author, a speaker, really a public theologian, and a person I've followed for the last 20 years. I heard about him, Brian McLaren, when I was at Fuller Seminary through a mutual. I guess it was a friend of his as a mentor and professor of mine named Ray Anderson, and so. He's been able to articulate a Christianity that is both deeply orthodox and maintains a real deep reverence of Scripture while moving and understanding some of the cultural inhibitors and some of the ways that it constricts culturally. And it's able to articulate that for, I think, a deeper freedom. And so I have recommended his books the last 15, 20 years, and I'll continue to do that. I think he's a great thinker and super generous with his time.
Yeah,
too.
Absolutely.
So I think we should call him in a couple weeks and see if he'll come back. It was that great.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. Talk about the iceberg and
that's right.
all that.
I'd love to see if he'd come to Chapelwood sometime and teach and preach for a weekend. I think he would be a really great person to be in, this dialogue with question-wise. So I think folks will enjoy this.
Absolutely.
We're really glad that you're here, and just thanks for your time, spending time with us, to talk a little. And I first heard your name from Ray Anderson at Fuller, and I took every class Ray Anderson taught, and then I TA'd for him for 3 years, and just could not get enough, and really used his systematics as a kind of as a workbook for ministry as I was planting a church. And it served me really well. I mean,
Well, that tells me a lot about you. You were smart to know there's a guy who's not only a professor, but kind of a mentor and really a trailblazer.
Yeah.
I'm so glad I got to meet him while he was still with us. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
What a good spirit.
Yeah, really. In so many ways, I feel like that you've continued on kind of his praxis of thought, and where I feel like in some ways he came up short just as a child of his own theological kind of upbringing and culture. You've carried that on in a place he couldn't.
Well, you may know this, but you may not. I got at Fuller, and Ray and I met when I was there, and he really kind of said that to me. He said, "I want you to keep going, please." And he was just so encouraging to me as kind of a younger brother, and it was very meaningful.
That's fantastic. You cut out at the very first part of before the Fuller. What was the connection?
I taught some short courses at Fuller, intensives. And so when I was out there once, he contacted me and said, I read a couple of your books. I'd love to get together. And I had read, what was his book that talked about Jerusalem and Antioch? I forgot the...
Yeah. Was it Emerging Theology for an Emerging Church?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I guess he was working on that at the time and asked me if I'd read the manuscript. And then I guess we stayed in touch and met up a time or two more. And I just felt very much like here was an older brother putting his arm around me and saying, go get him. It was very sweet.
That's awesome. That's great. Really have enjoyed kind of your newest book, which is really trying to help people navigate whether they stay in the church or go, and if they stay, how to stay. Could you talk just a little bit about that and how that emerged and why you wrote that?
Sure. So really my whole spiritual life has been living on the border of Christian identity. I grew up in a very strict fundamentalist setting. My parents were warm, loving people, but the kind of denominational tradition I was in was had a kind of brittle strictness and judgmentalism that, is very typical of fundamentalism in all its forms. Add to that, if you know what restorationism is, it's sort of a restorationist mindset that we're the group that finally got the last detail right, which produces a kind of almost a naive arrogance, like, well, somebody has to be right. I guess it's us. So, and for me, my first real conflicts came up really as a child because I was interested in science, and I could tell that my religious community did not like science. so I remember being, like a kid thinking, as soon as I'm 18, I'm out of here. I ended up having a very meaningful kind of spiritual experience in my teenage years that kept me in the faith. I ended up becoming a pastor, and but even through all those years, I always had a soft spot in my heart for all the people who would just come to me and say, yeah, am I the only one, or does this not make sense? And they might come with a question about atonement theory, or a question about heaven and hell, or a question about God planning sufferings, and they'd say, this just doesn't make sense to me. And I had to admit it, a lot of these things made no sense to me either. So that's really just been part of my life. And in many ways, it's why a guy like Ray meant so much to me, because the things I started writing about when I turned 40, I'd certainly been thinking about since I was 16. And it just takes a long time when you grow up in an authoritarian religious setting to get the courage to try to speak your truth if it doesn't fit in with what's expected.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that journey? Because it's interesting to me. I mean, growing up as a fundamentalist evangelical, kind of that progression that you've made to where now you are part of the Living School, and Richard Rohr's and so many other things that you are doing and how you're thinking. That progression seems to have a continuity within it. Like, you haven't just kind of chucked it, but you've and all along the way it seems like you've integrated in a way that is integral to some things that are core to you. Can you, one, I'd like to know about how that journey, and then two, those integral pieces,
Yeah, well, let me see if I can put those together. It's
okay.
Really, it's an interesting question, Matt. So one way maybe I could say it is, if I were to look back at the treasures that I got from my fundamentalist Christian background, one was that we took the Bible very, very seriously. And that has stayed with me. I just preached last Sunday, and I remember after my sermon, I just thought, what a fascinating book the Bible is. And I can't believe people get the chance to really think about it and get other people thinking about it. And, but because I took it seriously through my life, I no longer could take it literally. So they taught me to take it seriously, and they told me to take it literally. I kept the seriously, but not the literally, because the literal kind of interpretation, I realized, had its own history and story and agenda really behind it. So that's one sort of continuity and discontinuity. Another is that my heritage was very pietistic. This was not one of these, there are sort of hyper Calvinist groups that it's all in the head. In our community, there was a deep heart dimension to it as well. And so hymns were very, very important, and savoring the meaning of hymns. Well, when you savor the meaning of a hymn, or a psalm for that matter, you're really engaging with poetry. And you're not just engaging your rational intellectual part, you're allowing yourself to react and respond to the text too. And that kind of heart orientation, an integration maybe of head and heart and gut, so to speak, that stayed with me. And in fact, really has a deep continuity, and why when Richard Rohr and I became friends, I felt such a deep affinity, that's something as a Franciscan that he had as well, a deep, certainly a very alive and active and perceptive and sharp intellectual life,
Yes.
but not at the expense of heart and intuition and experience, but integrated with it. So that would be a second place where there's kind of continuity and discontinuity. I maybe this is just one other thing that comes to mind. The denomination and sort of whole movement of fundamentalism was really obsessed with heaven, going to heaven after you die.
Yeah.
Everything was about heaven, and that's a place where there was a major discontinuity for me, because when I was a pastor and I actually had to read the Bible and preach from it, and when I developed a habit of preaching through books of the Bible, so I preached through the book of Exodus or through the book of Genesis or through the book of Matthew or through the book of Romans. And when I would preach through, and I didn't just get to cherry pick a verse and preach a sermon on it, but I'd have to try to get the argument and see all those passages in between the verses that people like to pick out and preach sermons on. When I saw all of that, I realized the Bible is not an evacuation plan for heaven. It's a transformation plan for earth.
Yes.
And so that's a place where there was kind of almost a 180. To me, whatever we believe about the afterlife is primarily important in the way that it energizes us and gives us courage and willingness to sacrifice and even suffer in this life for the good of this world and our neighbors and future generations.
I love that. I love that. I think that was the thing about Ray's theology and then your writings that have helped me articulate, and in some ways almost have to, like, one of the reasons I've stayed Christian is in some ways I've had to give up heaven to become more human, right? That there was this sense that it wasn't to get me out of the world, but to embed us deeper within a world that God loves. And why is that turn, that metanoia, that turn so difficult for people?
Yeah, well, you know, in all of us who grew up Protestant, we really are still stuck in an argument with Catholicism, a 500-year argument. And what's interesting is that argument became so important for Catholicism that in many ways, Roman Catholicism has redefined itself in an argument with Protestantism. And when you have a 500-year argument, the things that you argue about become more deeply embedded.
Ingrained. Yeah, that's interesting.
So the way that we framed our argument with Roman Catholicism was, you have the wrong way to get to heaven, we have the right way to get to heaven. And so ironically, by having that argument, both sides deepen their obsession with heaven.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is so incredibly obvious, but when you're taught, I was taught to read every single verse in the Bible in light of a heaven-centered narrative, right?
Yes.
Of what happens after you die. That this life is really just like an exam that you take to see if you get entrance into
the real stuff,
graduate university in heaven, you know? So, but I remember when it suddenly dawned on me that in the Lord's Prayer, we don't pray, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. May we go to heaven where your will is done, unlike here on earth." That's not what we pray. The whole prayer is for the kingdom to come to earth.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so unbelievably obvious. Or you get to the very last chapter of Revelation, and it doesn't end with us all going to heaven. It ends up with the New Jerusalem coming down to earth. Right. And so, yeah, it's there everywhere, but we're trained so well, so much energy goes into keeping us from seeing that very, very obvious thing. And of course, it's not just sermons, but it's hymns and you know, just everything is framed around this invisible narrative.
I was reading some of Kester Bruin's work, and one of the things he talks about is this, like, not just Christianity, but really our culture, that it kind of starting maybe in the late 60s was desiring to get up and out of here. And whether that was like through the space program or LSD or this kind of ecstatic Christianity, it was all this desire to leave this place of earth and to find someplace else to go, right?
Yeah.
And I think that deep escapism is ingrained within our own faith as a part of that, where the burden of what it means to be human, like our Christianity, doesn't get us out of that either. It embeds us deeply within that polarity, that tension between both joy and pain. They're inescapable, right?
Yes. Well said. And it feels like there are these two polarities and both seem to be active today. One is, as you say, this sort of escapist modality.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this other that is a kind of desperation modality that says it's all up to us. This is the last gasp. This is the most pivotal moment. So throw your ethics out the window, because, like, as we're having this conversation, people will be listening to it at all different times, but as we're having this conversation, the hearings are going on for the January 6th committee.
Right.
So you have just all of these, I guess millions of people in the United States who really are okay with throwing out the Constitution, and as long as our side wins at the end, it gets to enforce the Constitution. There's a desperation in it. And I think in that way, both extremes have a certain desperation behind them, or you might say despair. This world is insalvageable. There's nothing we can do. So either man the lifeboats because the Titanic is sinking, there's no hope, or pull out your guns and let's stage an insurrection, and because the Titanic is sinking, let's have a mutiny because the ship is about to sink. So that desperation to me is, I guess you could say desperate people might run this way and they might run that way. The desperation, though, makes them not often act with a lot of forethought.
Yeah, that's right. I feel like that's where, in some ways, our Buddhist brothers and sisters, teaching, in some ways, it's a real call back to our own Christian roots, that embodied sense of where we are, right? And of learning how to breathe in this space, of learning how to face our own fear of death, our own sense of the other, making friends with our enemies along the way, those things that have always been ingrained, right, within our own faith. Where do we go from here in the midst of this tension that we're in? As for those of us who don't want to leave the church but can't stay in the church, that continue to perpetuate some of the things it's perpetuated, how do we continue to move forward? Yeah.
Well, maybe I could say two things about that. One, something in this book, Do I Stay Christian, that I did on at least two different occasions in the book, is I do these big overarching reviews of Christian history. Yeah. And I put a lot of work, it's easy to write a review like that. And it's also easy for it to be inaccurate. So I really tried to, make sure that I was giving an accurate portrayal in these big narrative arcs. But one of the things that you see is that the Christian faith has been pretty abysmal on a number of occasions. I mean, there are some low points.
Yeah.
You go late first century, early second century, when a big sector of Christianity turns anti-Semitic and never turns back. I mean, it infuses into Christianity this ugly, supersessionist, anti-Semitic strain. I mean, that's a pretty bad thing. And then a couple centuries later, the bishops make a deal with an authoritarian leader named Constantine. And I mean, a lot of what we see going on in Brazil and the United States and many other places involve Christian leaders doing similar kind of deals with authoritarian leaders today. That's a pretty ugly time. And you get into the, after about 1100 or so, when you have the rise of the Crusades and the Inquisitions, and then colonialism, and you just think that's a pretty bad run. So the Christian faith has had some really, really, really ugly, vicious, vile, betraying moments. And interestingly, right around those times are when some of the very, very best moments happen in the Christian faith too.
That's right.
And so and when I step back and I realize I'm quite certain that my Jewish friends could tell me of parallel examples in Judaism, and I'm quite certain my Muslim friends could give me almost identical patterns in Islam. And then I think, well, let's talk about the United States. Some pretty ugly moments in this country's history, along with some good moments. And so then you realize, oh, this is part of the human condition. Yeah. And we're always in this struggle of which will the better angels win, or the worse. And so that, I think, at the end of the day, is part of the human condition, which then forces all of us to make a choice, and that is, do we put ourselves in the game? Do we put ourselves in the contest? And do we understand our lives have the chance to lean one way or the other?
Yeah. So what are some of the issues that make your approach to Christianity a little different? Kind of growing up in thinking through systematic theology, where these are here are some of the linchpins of the way that you organize faith. And that worked for my life for a while until it didn't work. Right? Yes. Until it felt like as I've described sometimes, a T-shirt I was given as a child to wear. And as I grew, I was still trying to stuff myself inside of this smaller T-shirt and to act like things were normal. Right? It seems like that you've been able to replace some of the shirts that you're wearing to right size yourself for a humanity that you find to be complex. So what are some of those organizing ways of looking at your faith today?
Well, let me talk about two of them, our view of God and our view of the narrative that we're part of. So let me start with the narrative. I'd say just a memory comes to mind. When I first started writing, I would have all of my sort of evangelical peers be whispering, McLaren is a universalist, and so people would get up the courage and they'd say, are you a universalist? And I would say, oh, it's much, much, much worse than that. It's much worse than that. And they would say, what do you mean? And I would say, universalism is one way of answering the question, who goes to heaven and who goes to hell? It's much worse than that. I don't think that's the right question. I think the right question is, how can we join God in the healing of the earth so that we don't turn the earth into a living hell?
Come on.
And and one way to say it in terms of systematic theology, and it's so funny, I'd been a pastor for, over 15 years. Before I realized I was preaching through the book of Genesis. And I realized I'd been given this narrative of a perfect creation, and then something called the fall, and then a fallen history. And then some people experience salvation or redemption, and then they go to heaven, and those who don't go to hell. I call that the 6-line narrative, because it's 1 creation, 2 fall, 3 fallen history, 4 salvation, 5 heaven, or 6 hell. So it's like everything is explainable. The systematic is built around that narrative.
Yes, that's right.
And I become when I was preaching through Genesis once, I realized if I were reading this book as an innocent reader, in other words, without being told that I'm supposed to find those 6 lines, and I never would have found it there. And then I realized, of course, my Jewish friends, not one single Jewish scholar reads about a perfect creation and
No.
then a fall. The term "the fall" is something they would never use, and so I realized that this narrative has framed everything for Christianity. I think the narrative emerges around the time of Augustine and becomes the dominant narrative after Augustine. But in the early days of Christianity, it wasn't there. And by the way, it becomes the dominant narrative in Western Christianity. In Eastern Orthodoxy, that's not the dominant narrative. So that's the first thing. Sorry for that long discourse there, but but what happens is when that's your narrative, it gives you pre-packaged assumptions about what God is like.
That's right.
And God is primarily an absolutist perfectionist judge who is willing to torture people for eternity for the smallest legal infraction. And in fact, you don't even have to do a legal infraction because it's inevitable.
Yeah.
You will, just because the first humans, in a story you have to take literally, they committed a legal infraction. That means all of their ancestors will be tortured forever. I mean, talk about an unplausible a storyline for a good God, but it's what we ended up with. And another older evangelical who like Ray Anderson was very good to me was Dallas Willard.
Oh yeah.
And Dallas used to say, if your view of God is distorted, the more devoted you are, the sicker you are.
Wow.
And
wow.
And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah.
That's amazing. I kind of grew up handed this God that, whose main T-shirt just said Omni on it, and so,
yes.
and I remember Ray saying, kind of, when you start in the abstraction,
yes,
and then try to make your way back to earth, you just can't. Right.
Yes,
and
yes,
he used to say things like, at the beginning of Jesus's ministry, he could walk on water. At the end, he couldn't carry his own cross. So where is power? Right.
Yes.
And this idea of power has to be given up for the sake of relationships that are transformative in the earth. Right.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things that Christianity has lost in this up and out theology, or right by might theology.
Yes.
That we then can have these justifications to other each other into oblivion, right?
So true.
And it seems like at times the church that I've been a part of all my life, it's trying to find the plot amid it all.
Yes.
And it's there.
Yes.
It's just covered up in so many ways.
Yes, I think that's really true. And I remember the first book that I wrote directly about this came out in 2010. It was called A New Kind of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
I'd been dealing with this from some of my earlier books, but that's when I first talked about this 6-line narrative. And what I realized when I drew that on a napkin one day in a little coffee shop, I realized that's the narrative that's been there my whole life, and nobody ever made it explicit. I finally was able to make it explicit after, however, 45 years or whatever. And once it's explicit, you can ask yourself, is that legitimate or not? And it was interesting when that book came out, this one evangelical scholar basically just went after me because he said, that is the biblical narrative. That's the only one. It's the only one. If you don't hold that narrative, you cannot be a Christian. So I was sort of glad that by me making it explicit, it let people say yes or no.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things too, that as soon as you question that narrative, there are a whole lot of places you can't get a job.
That's right.
Because that narrative really is what makes things tick.
Yeah, right.
And when you talked about othering, oh my gosh, that narrative says the world started with everything good. The universe started with everything good, and it ends with some minority experiencing goodness and the vast majority experiencing eternal conscious torment.
Yeah.
Like all I could say is what kind of a good God would
right.
even start such a story, right? But here's the thing. If that's what God is doing in the world, we should, and we think that's the God we should emulate, then of course we'll do a lot of othering.
Yeah.
We're following the example of God.
Right.
And of course we'll find ourselves, nodding or winking at torture and other kinds of harm,
Right.
because it's morally present in the Supreme Being.
That's right.
So, yeah.
No, like Alyosha, there's a part of me at some point that had to give the ticket back.
Yes.
that ticket that said, "Oh, if this is who God is, right? Rwanda, Dachau,
Yeah.
The othering of African Americans in our country, whatever that is." And this is what it means to be Christian, to align myself with these things theologically. I didn't sign up for that. That's
Yes, it's so interesting you say that, because a fellow I have a lot of respect for named Brian Zahnd, a pastor in Missouri. Brian Zahnd wrote a book called Sinners in the Hands of Angry Christians, I think was the title.
What a great title.
And of course, playing on the old Jonathan Edwards,
Yeah.
Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But what I realized as I went through that process, I really wasn't deep in my heart afraid of God. I knew God was love.
Yes.
I knew that, as it says in John 14, so interesting, people always like to quote John 14:6 about I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And then they missed the verse a couple verses later where Jesus says, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. So how many people did Jesus torture? How many people did Jesus kill? How many people did Jesus hate? How many people did Jesus, scapegoat and shame? And ironically, by quoting John 14:6 and not whatever it is, 14:8 or 9, they, anyhow, just crazy how we do that. But
absolutely, absolutely.
I have a question. This is slightly off topic, but more about you as a thinker in general. And Matt's similar in this, but I see a lot of people in church, and I think in our nation, as they get older, they sort of double down on some of the original thought or their beliefs, ideologies, I think out of fear.
Yes.
I'm wondering how you move through your life, through your faith, while keeping some of those things kind of malleable, and if there is a moment you can think of that maybe sparked that, because I know you were a fundamentalist, so I'm assuming at some point there was something that changed that.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentalism, Jeff, it goes so deep. It really forms how you see the world. So it's, for me, it was 1,000 little cuts. For me, it was 1,000 frustrations, more like 100,000. And I did my very best to stay fundamentalist. And of course, when I heard the word evangelical, I thought an evangelical was a more tolerant fundamentalist. But what I found out is no, evangelicals are fundamentalists with some different practices, but fundamentalism still really reigns under the surface. And I did my very best to fix it. And I guess that I tell a story in a book I wrote called The Great Spiritual Migration, that if there was a moment, this was as close as any. I was at this Catholic retreat center with some other people in San Antonio, Texas area. And I was just, my theological struggles were just churning. I was battling with atonement theory in my dreams. You know what I mean? Like I was just in such deep theological pain.
Let me go, Mel Gibson.
Yes. And I couldn't sleep. I got up, I took this walk, and they had this beautiful desert garden at this monastery. And I stopped in front of this tree, and I just remember as I stood there, I thought, it's falling apart. and I can't patch it up. And I guess I'm just going to have to let it fall apart and see what I can do with the, with the ruins, so to speak.
Beautiful.
So it wasn't like a choice. It was a feeling like I cannot keep this structure. I can't patch it up anymore. It's collapsing. Yeah.
Well, that seems to be something that can map over both kind of like our own internal lives. There's a sense in which I think some of our construction of Christianity is really about our own internal selves and how we can create a place of eternal safety for ourselves.
Yes.
And so we construct this deep kind of if God is omni, then in my own sense of deep powerlessness, maybe there's a power that is greater than my fear of it all going to hell in a handbasket, it all falling apart, right? And it's what I hear you saying in that is that there's a necessary falling apart, both internally and externally, that is not outside the gospel, but may be summoned by the gospel.
Yes. I think that's a really important insight and sort of line of inquiry. It reminds me, Matt, I was just in conversation with a dear friend you may have heard of named Mirabai Starr, who doesn't identify as a Christian. She's of Jewish background, but has really been in kind of the Dharmic traditions. But her great love and great focus is the Christian mystic. So you would think she's a Christian by the way, her love for the mystics and her love for Jesus and all the rest. But Mirabai told me she's working on a book talking about the stages of grief, from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And as we were talking, I realized this is adulthood.
Yes.
Like we always talk about denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and now they've added a sixth stage, which is meaning. We always talk about those in relation to death, but I think it's what happens in adolescence, and it's what happens when you're an adult. You realize the world isn't this nice, sweet, easy place, as I was told, and so some people, their whole lives are spent in denial, and some people, their lives are spent in denial and anger.
Right.
And some people, their lives are spent in denial, anger, and bargaining. And some people maybe eventually that doesn't work. That's what happened to me that morning. My denial, anger, and bargaining fell into depression. and there was no saving it. But guess what? If there's going to be acceptance and meaning, it's not going to happen until you pass through that depression, which probably has a lot to do with the dark night of the soul and other things that we talk about.
Yeah. Well, which also seems to be like in my own thoughts about who God is. God was a real thing out there, when I was a kid kind of growing up. And in some ways whether that's called deconstruction or whatever that is, that, both I think philosophically, theologically, and then just personally, the Pema Chodron kind of insight that, everything falls apart, then it comes back together, it falls apart, it comes back together. That's the pattern, right? And I think that there's a part of my Christianity at the beginning that said, if you do it right, you can keep it from falling apart. And I wonder if that's the stage that we're in with some of our Christianity today, is that there's still folks that think if we can do it right, we can keep it from falling apart. If we can do it right, we can keep our country from falling apart. We can keep these things from happening. And I think that, at least internally, it feels like just a deep, you use the word desperation, that we're feeling, kind of this despair. And that there's a sense in which even our ideas of God have to fall apart. So that, and you talk about mystery, so along with Roar and all those things that have been very helpful to me, one
of the biggest maybe breakthrough moments in my life happened years ago while I was still a pastor, and on my day off, I would take a long walk along the Potomac River every Thursday that I could manage it. And I just realized I was having all these doubts about God, and I was praying about my doubts about God. And I thought, hold it. The fact that I'm praying says that I trust God.
Mm-hmm.
What am I having doubts about then?
Mm.
The fact that I'm spending my day off walking along this river thinking about God means I actually love God.
Yeah.
What am I having doubts about then? And I realized I'm not doubting God. I'm doubting my beliefs about God.
Yeah.
And that was like the first moment when I saw there was a little knife blade that could go in between these things that I fused together. God was my beliefs about God, which, by the way, is another word for God was my understandings of God. And you know, because
ideas.
my ideas, my concepts. Yeah. And the irony was, because I was fundamentalist, I'd memorized so many Bible verses. And as I was walking along, I thought of that Bible verse: trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. And I thought to myself, that includes my theological understanding.
Yeah.
And I remember at that moment, it may have been the first moment in my adult life when I exercised faith consciously to say, I'm going to trust the God I do not understand. I'm going to trust in the mystery beyond my understanding, because my understanding right now really sucks. You know, my understanding takes me nowhere. My understanding leads me in vicious circles that take me to not good places. Yeah. And so trusting was an act of not leaning on my own understanding.
Yeah, that's
so
beautiful.
I was glad I'd memorized that Bible verse. You know,
that's awesome. That's great. Well, one of the things that, like, as we're United Methodists, and one of the things that the denomination that we're struggling with right now, obviously, is just the whole area of human sexuality. Yes. And I've watched you over time shift in your understanding of human sexuality, and I wonder if you could talk about that a bit. And then also how you hold open folks that don't think the same way as you do around these things. Because in some ways, this has become kind of a litmus test for who's in and who's out in a way that I don't think it's necessary. You know what I mean? I just don't think it's necessary. Yeah. But I also understand the polarization of that.
Yeah. Well, we maybe could come back and talk about that, because I think in many ways the issue of homosexuality, like the issue of abortion, is like the tip of an iceberg.
Yes.
And it's the thing we talk about, but there are things under the surface that are way, way bigger. And they're the things that the subjects of abortion and homosexuality become the permissible thing to talk about.
Right.
But the deeper things maybe are way more significant. But my story on this, very quickly, is I because of my age, I grew up in an era where fundamentalism didn't have purity culture. Purity culture requires you to talk about sex. We just didn't talk about sex. We were so pure, we just didn't talk about it.
Didn't even say the word. It did not exist.
We were just
hello, Ken.
We were
hello,
so
Barbie.
uncomfortable. Oh my gosh. When I was a boy and we read the Bible after dinner, and we kept coming upon this word circumcision, and with total innocence, I just said, "What circumcision?" And when my parents explained it to me, I blushed, and I thought, that can't be in the Bible. This is just wrong, because already I internalized that sex just wasn't even part of the discussion. So when I had just turned 18 years old, senior year of high school, one of my very best friends came and said, "Could we take a walk?" And we took a walk, and he told me, I remember exactly where we were on the street, where he told me he was gay, and because we didn't talk about it, I didn't have even a big theological thing about, is it wrong? It just had to do with sex. So it was, it was already
wrong.
problematic. But but he was my friend, and he was one of the best people I had ever met. And so from the very beginning, I did not have the traditional view on homosexuality. From the very beginning, my first real data was that one of the 2 or 3 best people of my age that I'd ever met was gay, and he was obviously in deep self-hatred about it and all the rest. And if anything, I just felt like saying, "You're such a good guy. That's not that big a deal," But it was a big deal for him because he'd internalized all of this self-hatred, and so it was complicated for me. And I was never outspoken on the subject. I like a lot of people, I just tried to avoid the subject because I didn't think it made sense to watch how Christians treated gay people. But what happened was, many years later, I can't even, I would take me some serious math to figure out about what year this was. But you may know the name Tony Campolo and his wife Peggy. And Peggy had been very outspoken about LGBT equality. And Peggy called me one day and said, "Hey, Brian, I think you're closer to where I am on this subject than you are to where my husband is." And she said, "There's a church in Little Rock, Arkansas, led by a gay pastor, and they would like to invite you to come speak. He really respects you, likes your books." And she said, "It would be devastating if he were to invite you and you were to turn him down."
Wow.
And she said, "But I need you to know that if you speak there, it's Arkansas, and there are the Baptist police who will be paying attention. And if you speak there, they will be sure to paint a target on your back about it." So she said, "I guess I'm like the junior high kid who says, so-and-so would like to go out on a date with you. Would you say yes if they ask you?" And so I said, it just in my heart, I knew I had to say yes. And so that meant, going public about that I was willing to go public about not stigmatizing LGBTQ people. Well, the thing that I had no way of knowing, that event where I spoke was either in November or early December, I forget which. I think it was in December, early December. And March of the following year, I have 4 children. One of my sons came out, and then a few months later, one of my daughters came out. So I have 4 children. 2 of my children are gay, and I was so glad that I had, in a sense, already gone public on that issue before my kids. And I wasn't one of those people who thought that, was afraid that my kids were gay. I just never even thought about it. I never crossed my mind. But anyway, that's the too long version of my story on this subject.
I know that we're probably needing to wrap up soon. How do you hold open conversation with folks in this way, folks that have not either had those experiences but are still struggling to say, well, that's a bridge too far?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the truth is, I don't think. Well, to me, it's very ironic for Methodists because Methodists have women ministers.
Oh,
and if there are
right.
verses that say you can't have women ministers. So the people who won't accept gay people because of Bible verses they can quote, the 6 so-called clobber passages. Well, you can find those kinds of passages about having women ministers. So to me,
or
it's
divorced
just
people.
Always yes. So what this says to me is that this issue isn't the issue.
Okay.
That's when I said the tip of the iceberg. So when people want to talk to me about it, I just, from the start, I know that this issue is not the issue.
Okay.
There are deeper issues. And the deeper issues usually have to do with belonging. That if I were to come out in acceptance of gay people, my parents would reject me, or my congregation would fire me, or the top 3 donors in my church would withhold their giving. And so what I realize is these are almost always issues of belonging, way more than they're issues of, biblical interpretation. So I start with just empathy for the predicament that people are in with belonging. and then what I guess I try to do is I just try to say, well, listen, if you want to reject gay people, then you need to reject me too. I'm not gay, but gay people are my family. Gay people are my friends. And so if you're going to reject people, you're going to have to reject me too. And a lot of people say, okay, I'm happy to do that, you know. But I suppose what I want to do is I want to say, this issue of belonging goes both ways.
It does.
So for you to keep the good graces, stay in the good graces of these people who you know they'll reject you, just realize that that has consequences too of other people you will then have to reject.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. A couple rapid fire questions. Who are you reading right now that is having an impact on the way you're imagining the world, yourself, and others?
It's funny you say that. I just, there was a book I was supposed to read in graduate school that I never read.
Yeah.
By Stanley Fish called Self-Consuming Artifacts. And I found a copy from a
public
used
library
bookstore, from a public library that ended up at a used bookstore. And so that's the book I'm reading right now. Just it's helping me understand myself as a writer. It's a book about literary criticism, and it's just absolutely fascinating. But if I were to say two of the most meaningful, important books that helped change the way I see the world, one of them is called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I just can't recommend that book highly enough.
Great book.
Helping us see the world from an indigenous perspective. And then I read a novel a couple of years ago, probably the best novel I've read since I was in graduate school, called The Overstory. And a book about trees, but it's a book that makes you see the world differently.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah,
that's great.
Instead of, when you're done with the book, instead of thinking, this is a world of human beings with trees in it, you think, this is the planet of trees with human beings in it.
That's awesome. What's on your playlist, music-wise?
Oh my goodness, I'm a big singer-songwriter person, so I'm always looking for great singer-songwriters. Two of my, if I were, probably three of my favorites these days are, of course, I've been a Jackson Brown fan since I was a kid. Bob Dylan. I mean, I just never get tired of Dylan. But there are a couple of, I don't know if you're familiar with David Wilcox.
Oh, yeah.
One of my favorite singer-songwriters. Yeah. Another is Carrie Newcomer, phenomenal singer-songwriter. And then another is Andy Gullahorn. Oh my goodness, what
Andy's great. Andy's great. Yeah. I've gotten to know him.
Oh, and another one of my favorites just passed away last year. Who's a good friend, Fran McKendry.
Okay.
Just beautiful music. Yeah.
What poetry are you reading?
Let's see. I read poetry all the time, and often it's poetry I read because I use it in talks that I give.
Okay.
But Mary Oliver, Wendell Berry are people I'm always going to because their poetry works really well.
Yeah.
Padre Gotuma is a dear friend, and I love his work. He has a poem called, I believe it begins, God of Change, and it is just really relevant to a lot of things we've talked about today.
That's great. Brian, thanks so much for your time with us. We just can't thank you enough for just your openness and generosity of heart and spirit and mind. You're a gift to not only our lives, but the world writ large. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Keep up the great work.
Okay. We'll see you. God bless you.
Hello, neighbor. How are you? Really wanna shower you with love. Hello, neighbor, how are you? Really wanna challenge you to love.